Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is City of Heroes on the Rebirth server. Let's rant with Scrapperlock, and we're with Psyop, our mutation stalker, who's 12th level. Oh, and by the way, I now have 2 something million influence even after getting a full set of dual origin level 15 enhancers for our character because I got a couple of super packs. I've got like a whole bunch still left in here from my other characters. 16, but I opened up 4 because I had 20 of them, and yeah, sold a bunch of Defender and Blaster stuff on the auction house, and I have got 2 million more influence. So this character is set for life, basically. And we are at the top of the world. This is as high as you can go on this map. Can't go any higher. I'm pushing up, but you can't. And so I came to this nice high building just because I could. And probably my favorite thing about City of Heroes when it came out back in 2004 was that you could do this because in most other games, your character was tied to the surface. You could go up like this, right? Like, say, in Star Wars Galaxies, you could, if there was a surface like this, you might be able to climb it, like, along the edge, right? But you couldn't go further than this up off of it, right? There was no three-dimensionality in most games at the time, and most games even today don't have this kind of three-dimensional freedom that you get in City of Heroes. So I just wanted to sort of do a little shout out to that because it's awesome. All right, so now we are going to gather intelligence on the Lost because we are still working for Montague Castellaneta. And as we go, it's time for our next Let's Rant. And again, I don't know how much of a rant this is going to be, but a discussion, a dialogue about, and what I'm calling this is plan versus play. So this is a really interesting dichotomy of planning versus playing, and I think a lot of people aren't thinking about this when they build their role-playing game campaign as a GM or their character as a player about the difference and about whether they and their group are more interested in planning or playing. This doesn't mean that you can't do both because you kind of have to do a little of each. But what do I mean by, in a role-playing game, planning versus playing? Well, let me start with a story. I just finished watching the the final episode of the 5th season of the Wild Cards Deadlands show on the Saving Throw channel. It was a great campaign. They went 5 full, like 12 or so episode seasons, and then at the end, they had a what they call a campfire, like a round table where they talked to the audience and they answered questions that the audience had submitted ahead of time. And somewhere around the hour and 45 mark, if you want to watch it yourself, you can, in that final episode, that campfire talkback in season 5, they were talking about, I guess they'd been asked what their favorite scenes were. And what they came up with were scenes. Oh, I love doing this with a stalker because we clean out the whole dungeon and then come back for her, and that keeps her alive. What they talked about were scenes that were these sort of epic cinematic scenes that were really cool, where things just worked out so perfectly and so exactly the way they needed to like just have a great outcome. And as they described their favorite scenes, where they kind of worked together to where all the pieces just fell into place and you had this very sort of storybook or blockbuster movie kind of moment. Dom Zook, who's one of the players, very astutely and I think quite correctly said that in a role-playing game, you almost never get the chance for a truly cinematic scene because cinematic scenes where everything kind of comes together and reaches a very satisfying climax perfectly and it all works together take discussion and planning and setup, and that it's very hard to do this while you're playing live at the table and rolling dice. I mean, sometimes the dice just don't go that way, and sometimes the other players don't realize which way you're trying to go, and so it's very hard to do. And then Jordan Pridgeon, who's another one of the players, jumped in and made another excellent point, which is that cinematics are not a cinematic scene is not just about surprising you with the unexpected. In fact, quite the opposite. He said that's just a surprise. A cinematic scene to him is one that is set up ahead of time, and then when the dominoes start to fall, they all fall in exactly the right way to get this satisfying result. And so, um, and so, and then the other players all jumped in and agreed and said yes, that they got lucky a few times during this 60 or 70 episode campaign. They got lucky a few times where they got this very cinematic result without planning it ahead, just by luck, just because um, they picked up on each other's cues and they got to know each other's patterns, and the GM picked up on what they were doing, and it sort of all came together, and the die rolls came together, and everything just worked perfectly, and they got this really movie-like or novel-like result. But that it's very, very hard to do that without some sort of planning, right? It came out in play at the table, but most of the time to have that kind of a result, you'd need to plan it out, you'd need to talk it out, you'd need to work together on it. So let's see, is this where we're going? I think this is where her chest is gonna be, no? Has it just not spawned yet? It's such a great advantage to be a stalker, because we can scout the whole thing out and then take Lady Jane where we need to go. Maybe that's just an empty chamber. So one of the things that playing solo, this is the way we need to go. Playing solo, playing randomly, using random number generators to inspire me, coming up with the story as I go, as I did in Ironsworn and Starforged, and watching the Wildcards guys also do that, just come up with the story as they go, has really taught me the value of, I'm not going to say improvisation, because that's not really, rolling dice isn't improvisation, right? How you interpret the dice might be. But I want to say the emergent nature of a role-playing game. My best friend, sometimes there's a confluence of things. My best friend actually asked me over the weekend after my D&D game ended, my campaign finally ended on Saturday, and there's going to be an interim GM. One of the players is going to just run for a couple months, and then supposedly in January or February, my best friend is going to take over. I have doubts about whether he's going to be ready that early, but hopefully he will. And he was asking me about what I like in a role-playing game. Like, so what do you like? We were talking about backstory, and I said I don't really like having a long, complicated backstory, and because he was talking about wanting to weave the backstories of our characters into the narrative and everything. And I would argue that this is planning, right? He reads what I wrote ahead of time, which is sort of my plan for the character or the backstory. I don't know. His backstories always include implied plans for his character, right? Like the missing girlfriend and the missing mother that he had and that he was looking for implied a plan to find them, right? And he outright stated, my character wants to find them. And he was only with the party because he thought, based on some role play, that being with them would lead him to finding them, right? So he had a plan that he was trying to bring into fruition, right? His character didn't decide to look for his mother as a result of die rolls or something that happened at the table. He planned out that his character was going to look for and eventually find his mother and his girlfriend, right? And he would have been incredibly disappointed if after the end of the campaign yesterday or the other day, his character had never met either one of them in play, right? So that was planned out. And I was sort of saying, no, I don't want to do that. I mean, my backstory is there to explain why my character has their abilities, right? and why they're doing what they're doing, right? And then when we get done with this battle, I'll show you this character's backstory. It's literally that. It's how she has her stalker abilities and why she's a superhero, and that's it. Okay, so let's look at her background. She was blind from birth. She used a walking stick. She navigated by touch and sound, and then when she had puberty, typical mutant backstory, she began to hear people's thoughts and see with her mind scanning and champions and so on. And so she then learned to project those thoughts and, become like able to hit people with psionics. So she was noticed by the FBSA, which is the Bureau of Superhero Affairs, and recruited to their Special Ops Division, and she's basically a Black Ops agent for them, right? And so she's used to sneak into bad guy areas and take them down. That's it, right? I don't mention her family. I don't mention anything about that. Because what the wildcards guys would say is, don't lock yourself into that. That would be planning out the relationships. Instead, give yourself a basis to start and then allow family relationships and other backstory, quote unquote, elements to emerge during the role play in whatever way works for the scene. This gives you maximum freedom to cooperate with the other players at the table to create that cinematic moment, right? To create that really good interaction that you wouldn't be able to have if your backstory says, but no, wait, I can't do this because I'm looking for my mother, right? And so this character is this is why she's a superhero and how she got her powers. That's it. Anything else, like if I joined a roleplay guild and somebody started asking me how many other children there were at home and whether I'm an only child, I would make that up on the spot. And as Jordan Pridgeon said in a different campfire, I think during East Texas University, he said he believes that nothing is canon. Where am I going here? South. Nothing is canon until it happens at the table. And that consequently, whatever I wrote in the backstory would not be canon unless it happened in roleplay with my roleplay guild, right? And so, it's a boss. Okay. So anyway, this friend of mine, who's going to be the long-term GM, and we were talking about this, and he said to me, kind of, so what? I forgot to take a break for you. I keep forgetting about the fact that I don't have Mez defense with this character yet. Hopefully, he will not Mez me too much. So he said, what, after we got done arguing, because he really likes the planning part. He plans a lot. He plans his character out to level 20 when it's level 1 to figure out, how he's going to, how he's going to build the character and what magic items he's going to want. I mean, he tries to do, like, to plan his whole character out to level 20 and then make it happen. And I don't think he understands not doing that. He just expects everybody to do that, I think, because he's a planner. And I used to be one too, right? I'm not really knocking it. I'm saying I've come to value the lack of planning. So he said, what are you looking for in a role-playing game? And I said, to me, what I want to get out of a role-playing game at the highest level, right, is being able to experience a shared fictional story. And I don't think he understood it. He said, well, what does that mean? And I said, it means that a group of players gets together and creates a story in which the whole story is greater than the sum of its parts. And then I explained to him that the reason I don't like a long, involved backstory is because when I write a backstory, right, this paragraph here was written before I ever joined a superhero group and before I ever this character ever encountered her fellow heroes, right? True for any character. I wrote the backstory by myself, right? It's a backstory, not a back roleplay log. So I wrote the backstory by myself. I didn't do it with the other players at the table, so it's the only part of this character's storyline, the rest of which happens at the table. It's the only part of her storyline that is um, that is not a shared fictional experience, right? It's just written by me, probably with the agreement of the GM, but there's very little collaboration. My friend's backstory about his mother and his character's mother and girlfriend and where he was born and all that stuff, I approved it, but I didn't help him write it. And he used, to be honest, as little of the world lore as he could and still keep his backstory the same way as it was when he wrote it in the Forgotten Realms when the other guy was going to GM, right? So that's completely uncollaborative, right? There's no collaboration going on there. That's him writing his own story. And then after he started to play, the things that happened to his character, that was the shared fiction. And he was so locked into his plan. Now, I didn't say all this to him, but he was so locked into his plan that when his character didn't end up turning out the way he had pictured it at level 1 by level 3 or 4, he actually asked me if he could basically reboot his character. He had this bizarre idea. I told one of the newest player, I told her about this a couple weeks ago, and she was like, I don't get it. Why was he doing this? She doesn't understand it at all because she doesn't really plan things out the way he does. She doesn't know enough about the game to plan them out to the nth degree the way he does, right? And she didn't buy the DM's guide, so she doesn't know what the magic items are. And, she looks up what's going to happen at next level when they are about to get to the next level. And so, yeah, he actually asked me to, I'm not sure if I've mentioned this on this channel, he told me he wanted to, his character was like, say, 25 years old. He wanted to de-age him to like 13. And I said, why? And he said, because he's not coming out the way I wanted, right? I.e., the way he planned. He planned some sort of a way for him to be interacting with the party, and the way he was actually interacting with the party in play with the other characters live at the table, plus the NPCs that I was running, well, it wasn't quite working out the way he had envisioned it, the way he had planned. And so the play at the table was secondary to him, right? Of primary importance for him was the plan that he had for his character. And I'm not trying to argue that this is a right or wrong way, because I used to plan things out too. I mean, I don't know if I would do mids and pines, but I used to plan out my City of Heroes characters. There was some kind of a planning thing where you could plan out like the enhancement slots and what you were going to get when, and then what you were going to put in there. Maybe it was mids or pines. There was some early version of it back when the game was live. There was a little program to do that, and I used to do that, right? And then I would try to make it happen. So I certainly planned things out. My campaign with the bad guy, I didn't have a rigid plan, but I had a generalized plan, right? And I was much happier when we were doing more spontaneous stuff that wasn't planned than trying to make the plan happen, which never works anyway because the players never do what you expect, right? And so I used to be a planner too. I'm not arguing that he's wrong to do it. I think it makes your life a lot more difficult. I think that the cleric and the ranger and the eldritch knight fighter, who kind of figured their character out as they went. Two of them explicitly said that's what they were doing. The other one just seems to have. I don't know for sure if she was, but she seems to have. They were figuring out as they go, right? That that made them a lot happier. They didn't try to reboot their characters, right? Whereas my best friend wanted to reboot his. He eventually gave up on this idea. And he finally did start giving him stuff that I don't think he would have thought to pick initially for some of his traits, and like feats and stuff. But that only happened like after 10th level. For the first 8 or 10 levels, he was really trying to make this character be the way he had planned. And what I would encourage people to do is at least give yourself the opportunity to try letting things just happen in play and playing off each other rather than trying to plan it out and then try to get it so that each other is following a plan that you didn't tell each other, which can be very difficult to pull off. As any GM can tell you, if you plan it out a lot, well, players are going to do the opposite. That's why it's so hard to run written modules, because the module assumes the players will do one of two or three things, and players will almost always do something else that the module writer didn't write down. And now, as a GM, you got to completely improvise it. And if you're not an experienced GM, and you don't realize that this is probably going to happen, you could end up with, a lot of challenge. What's going on here? Don't I have a quest item I have to craft? Grave dirt? Where do I have to go to get the grave dirt? Maybe he'll give it to me. Ah, okay. I know this mission a little too well and got ahead of myself. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I have become a champion of what I want to call the emergent property, the emergent story. So let me talk a little bit about the sort of the research that I used to do in science. And I don't want to get too into the weeds, but for a long time I studied animal group behavior. And when animal groups get together, the whole of the group is greater than the sum of its parts. You have characteristics of a flock of birds, like the V formation, that don't have any meaning when applied to an individual. A single individual cannot have a formation, right? Or we talk about polarization, where they're all lined up the same way. A single individual, this character cannot be polarized, right? Because she's not aligned with anything else, right? Alignment, in the sense of lining up in the same direction, that is not something that you can measure about a single individual, right? The inter-individual spacing, nearest neighbor distance, she doesn't have any of these characteristics. These characteristics are properties of a group. And when we observe them in things like fish and birds and other coordinated animal groups, what we find is that they create these very typical patterns, swirl patterns, circular patterns, V-shaped patterns, aligned groups. These are characteristic things that we see across animal taxonomic groups. And those of us who study them call them emergent properties. And the best definition I've heard of an emergent properties came from one of my collaborators, where he said emergent properties are group characteristics that result from the individual interactions, but are not up to any single individual to determine. So now if we think about, oh, these guys are really low level. Oh, well, it's fine. If we think about the storytelling aspect of a role-playing game and playing at the table versus planning it out, right? What I would argue is that the storytelling, at least that I'm talking about, the shared fiction of the storytelling, is an emergent property of the table, right? It results from the various interactions among the players, but it is not up to any single player or player character to determine. Let me go to Skyway City. It's faster. It'll be faster. I didn't realize, I wasn't thinking about how high level we already were. So what I would argue is that the story of our Roman campaign, we've got a bunch of journals that each player wrote down for every session. And it's all done in their voice. And one of the things my players said is they want to save that journal and put it together. One of them is going to actually make a Word file out of it. I tried to export it from our World Anvil website, and it can export into individual HTML files. It used to export to a PDF, but it doesn't seem to do that anymore. And so I said I'm not going to sit there and manually assemble it, but one of them or two of them are going to work together on it. And they want to put it into a story. And that journal, from chapter 1 to chapter 56, right, which is going to be probably 100 pages, 120 pages long. It's like a novella. That novella, that's the story of the campaign. That is an emergent story, right? It resulted from all of the interactions of the players with me, the GM, and all of the characters with the non-player characters, the players and non-player characters. It resulted from those interactions, but it wasn't up to any one of us to determine, not me as the GM, and not any of the players. And so, as I came to realize that this is going to be rough, isn't it? As I came to realize that you could view the story of a campaign, the story that happens at the table session after session, as an emergent property, right? And being someone who's studied them, I came to believe that planning them out is probably not going to work in the same way, because you can't plan out an emergent property, then it's not emergent. Oh boy, I guess we're going back to King's Row. I could have sworn there were some mid-level guys around here among the Lost, but I guess not, because this is pretty brutal over here. So what I would urge you to do is, if you view the story that you're building at the table as an emergent property, then you don't have to try to force it to go anywhere. Oh, this might work if I can find some Lost over here. You don't have to force it to go anywhere, right? By himself. You don't have to force the story to go anywhere. You can just treat it like an emergent property and let it go wherever the story emerges. So that's my suggestion. That's what I mean by play versus plan, right? Your play is the emergent story, right? It's the story that comes about as a result of the interactions at the table, whereas planning is what the GM does ahead of time when he writes his module or she writes her module. It's what the players are doing when they're that's pretty rough. It's what the players are doing when they're kind of planning out what they want their character to be like, right? And the more planning you do, the less you're having a shared fictional experience, the less collaborative it is, right? And the less planning you do, the more collaboration you can have. So again, as I say, these things often come full circle, and they often happen like in groups, like the same ideas happen. I come across them in different venues. So there was this conversation I had with my friend, and then I had when I was watching the Wild Cards campfire, the one guy said, "Yeah, it's very hard to get cinematic results from role play at the table, right?" But also, later in that same episode, or maybe earlier in that episode, Jordan Callerman, who is the GM, had said something like, well, he was asked like how the campaign progression went for him, and he said that one of the things he learned to do was do a lot less planning. He learned to trust that the players would make something cool out of whatever he gave them. And so he started just saying, I'm going to make up a challenge to put in front of them and see what they do with it, instead of trying to plan it all out. And he said he had a lot more fun, and he thought the players had a lot more fun when he did that, and that the story went in all these cool, unexpected directions. That's the emergent story, right? That's play versus plan, right? So we have multiple people talking about this from different angles, and I think a lot of folks, if you watch like the DM advice on a lot of these YouTube channels, a lot of them kind of say the same thing, that if you just let stuff happen, right? Use random number generators, random wandering monster tables, or random monster tables, and randomly roll up what kind of a dungeon it's going to be. You could randomize a lot of it, and then just see what the players make of it. That can often lead to a lot of fun, and it also gives the players the A word, right? Agency. If you just put some ideas in front of them and let them make what they will of it, then they have complete agency because you didn't plan it all out, right? Ultimately, the plan that goes exactly the way you want it in every particular is a railroad, right? And Luke Hart actually said this in response to somebody talking about people making up a big long backstory and then expecting the GM to include all of their backstory elements just as they wrote them into the campaign and role play about it. And Luke said, that sounds to me like a self-railroad, right? And this is what I'm talking about. When you're doing all of that pre-planning and then trying to force the play at the table, like force the quote-unquote emergent story to come out the way you planned. Well, now it's not an emergent story. It's kind of a railroad. And it's sort of like you're railroading the other players, right? I mean, if you think about it in a very real sense, my best friend, by writing a background that said, my character wants to find his mother and wants to find his girlfriend, and then he kept telling me, I would like to find these characters, please put them into the game. He was kind of railroading the rest of us, because it's not clear that the other players necessarily had any interest in finding his character's mother or wife or girlfriend, right? And then if he had wish lists of magic items, he planned out what magic items he was going to get by whatever levels and feats and everything, and then he gave me the list and said, this is what I want to get between now and level 20. Well, wasn't he kind of railroading us? Right? Not just me, because the other players have an interest here too, right? They're part of the campaign. And he was kind of, that was, now I'm not saying it was like bad, right? But on the scale of complete freedom to go anywhere sandbox versus on the rails railroad, what he was doing with his character was very much an on the rail, or trying to do was very much an on the rails plan. Now, I think he would probably vehemently disagree with me that it was a railroad, but I think it self-evidently was, right? That he was trying to make his character come out by level 20 exactly the way he wrote him out at level 1. And he even had, I think, ideas for what he thought it was going to be like when he met his girlfriend and his mother. And I don't know about the mother, but I got the very clear sense from him that he was very disappointed in how I ran and presented the girlfriend, right? And I don't think objectively it was because I ran it badly. I think it's because I didn't stay on the railroad tracks. I didn't follow the plan that he had in his head. He didn't tell me his plan, right? This is the problem. As a role player, you don't, like, he didn't tell the other players his background, but he wanted them to play into that background. right? I knew it, but the other players didn't know it, right? He wanted to do the whole like live stream thing where you like keep your background secret from each other and then reveal it at the table. But how are the other players going to play into a plan that they don't even know exists, right? Or they don't know any of the details of that plan? They can't, right? And so you only have two choices. You can make them stay on your rails. This is my plan. You're supposed to be reacting to my character this way. Please do as I say. Or the plan isn't going to work and it's going to go a totally different way. Because that's what happens when you have a group of people together and they're all making up stuff and having to also subjugate their ideas to the rolls of the dice, right? And so I guess what I'm trying to say here is that although it's okay to plan things, the more you plan out, I feel like the more destined you are to be frustrated and unsatisfied because the dice are never going to go the way you need them to go to make your plan work. Ever. And therefore, the dice will always screw you. I mean, go and watch my Ironsworn or Starforged playthrough or any playthrough you want of Ironsworn or Starforged that other people have made. And you will see anytime they made a plan, they got a missed match, matched miss, and it upends everything. They finish their vow, they think it's over, they roll a miss, they didn't finish their vow, right? They were mistaken. Things weren't what they seemed, right? You learn very quickly in Ironsworn and Starforged. Don't make big, long, detailed plans because the game will shatter them. Absolutely will do that. And it's supposed to, right? Because what Sean wants you doing, the whole point of it, is using the Oracle and your storytelling instincts to make cool and surprising to you stories happen, right? I'm getting ready to do some solo role-playing. Well, I'm looking around as much as possible for all sorts of means of having having my own game surprise me. I'm playing the player characters and the monsters. How am I going to surprise myself? Well, the Flextail Solo Adventuring Toolkit, the Flex AI Guidebook. These are ways to like get the monsters or the PCs, however you want to do it. You roll them up, and you roll up their behavior. Okay, this guy is a controller. So you look on the controller table, and he's bloodied. He's half dead. So you look on the bloodied controller table, and then he's outnumbered. So you roll for the column of he's in a weak position on that table, and you make a die roll. And it says it has percentages based on the fact that he's a bloodied controller in a weak position, and it'll say use his secondary power. It's randomized, right? I'm probably going to use something like the Mythic GM emulator. I'm going to grab some random tables from Ironsworn and from other books, Scarlet Heroes. I'm going to have a whole bunch of random tables to use. Why am I doing that? Because it's the only way that I can surprise myself, right? Because otherwise, if things just go the way I want, other than rolling hits and misses in combat or failing a dramatic task, I won't be surprising myself, right? And by surprising yourself, you get the creative juices flowing and you come up with a story that you wouldn't necessarily have planned out. But that's the whole point of a role-playing game. To me, if you want to just tell a story that goes according to an outline, you can write a novel or a short story, right? That's what you do when you write a novel. You make an outline, you develop characters, and you make everything all work, and it becomes quote-unquote cinematic because you can force all the dominoes to fall where they need to fall as a writer. But in a role-playing game, you can't force it because the dice don't obey you. And if you, instead of resisting the dice and fighting it lean into what the dice are telling you, you will get a surprising story that will go in directions you never expected. Again, if you watch my Ironsworn and Starforged games, there were aspects of the actual game system of Ironsworn, particularly the combat, that frustrated me. But the ability of that game to generate surprising results of story and take the story in directions that you don't expect. My Ironsworn game didn't go anywhere near where I expected. I thought my guy was going to be a monster hunter, and the very first random quest that I came up with was he was going after some human cult. And then that interaction led to quest after quest after quest that finally led to him finding out that his father had been murdered by his uncle, which I had no idea when I started. I just knew that he had been sort of turned out of his house by his parents. When we went back to his parents, his mother told him that his father was dead, he'd been killed by his uncle, and I found out that the uncle was actually a higher up in the cult that he was hunting by just random chance. So now he's going after this cult because he's going after his uncle to get revenge for killing his father. This is nothing like what I expected when I started. And that's not bad, right? To go, well, but I wanted him to be a monster hunter. That's the plan, right? But what ended up in play was a much more interesting story about a cult and an evil god named Angus, who had maybe brought about the cataclysm that I knew had happened in the rest of the world but didn't know what it was. And now the worshippers of Angus are here in the Ironlands, and they're starting to try to bring the cataclysm here. But the Ironlands were protected somehow, and I had an idea for how, but I never really got into it because then this character died, right? And then I made up a character in Starforged, and a series of random rolls led her to find an item that was the same type of item as the guy in Ironsworn had. And I had this vague idea, I never actually developed it, that because his soul was trapped in this stone, that this orb, this was the same orb, that somehow, 25,000 years later, it's in another galaxy, having survived and passed from person to person. And if she got sucked in there, my Starforged character, she was going to meet the Ironsworn character. Or if she was able to figure out how to manipulate this thing to turn it off or whatever, he was going to pop out of it. This is what I thought, maybe, right? And join her crew or something. Never, ever would have imagined making up that story if I hadn't had die rolls play at the quote-unquote table, in this case the virtual table, that gave me those ideas through random rolls, oracles, action and theme tables, successes when I didn't expect them, failures when I thought I was going to be successful, and taking the story in directions I didn't expect it to go. Right? That's the play. And the play is what surprises you and excites you. To me, that's what I'm looking for in a role-playing game. The shared fiction, the emergent story that comes together from everybody working together to build something. Like my Rome campaign, it didn't work out the way I kind of imagined it would work out when I first wrote it. It was way better than anything I could have planned. And it was super awesome at the end. It was a great finale. And everybody, they were only 13th level. They didn't get to 20th level. There was a whole bunch of adventures that I didn't run. But the story that came out of it was awesome. And it's not something any of us could have planned. And so, folks, my advice to all of you is if you haven't tried just letting the play give you an emergent story versus planning everything out, I highly recommend trying it. Try the play over plan. Just make a skeletal backstory like this one. Right? Just here's how I got my powers or whatever and why I'm a hero. And make sure it's a good enough reason. And then let them join the adventuring group or the hero team or whatever. And then let the rest of the story come out in role play at the table. It's not canon unless it happens at the table. And as long as you think of those in those terms, I think you can get a really cool emergent story to come out that is nothing like you would expect. You will surprise yourself, you will surprise each other, and when you look back on it, you will say, man, this was so cool, and it didn't happen at all the way I would have thought it would. It almost always, every time I've seen that, what actually happens is way better than I would have planned. Which is why I like playing role-playing games better than writing stories, because the stories are just what I plan in my head. But the role-playing games, that story surprises me, much more so than a short story or a novel does. All right, I think we'll leave it here. Hopefully that was useful for everybody. Until next time, I am Scrapperlock, and this has been City of Heroes. Let's rant with Scrapperlock.